everybody from the lunch break. I hope you all feel refreshed for our first afternoon session, which is on imagined animals. My name is Lena Pfeifer. I'm a PhD candidate here at Würzburg, and I'm very happy to be chairing this panel. As you can see from the program, we have two 60-minute sessions, one session now with two speakers, a break, and then a second session. So you will see me twice today. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, who is Kathleen Costello-Sullivan. And she is a professor of modern Irish literature and the former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. In addition to a number of articles and book chapters, she is the author of the monographs Mother Country, Politics of the Personal in the Fiction of caint, published in 2012. And the second monograph is Trauma and Recovery in the 21st Century Irish Novel, published in 2018. She's also the editor of two critical editions, Joseph Sheridan Lefenu's novella Camilla, published in 2013, and Nora Holt for Women in 2016. Kate has served as president of the American Conference for Irish Studies, North American rep for IASIL, and has served since summer 2018 as the first female serious editor of the Syracuse University Press's Irish line. Her current research focuses on representations of the nurturing parental body in Irish literature, and she has two book-length co-edited collections forthcoming. Her talk today is entitled Being Human Never Did Any Good, Disability and Empathy in Sara Baume's Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither. So join me in welcoming Kathleen to the stage.
Thank you. Feel free to call me Kate. I'm setting a timer. I'm not waiting for a call. Just if you see me. Okay. So this talk, as talks do when they're evolving, has shifted slightly. So the title has shifted slightly. It's less explicitly about disability, more emphasis on empathy. It's not poetry, but I will talk about birds. So there is that. And so the subtitle is now Redefining Society in Sara Baume's Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither. And I think Professor Vega's talk this morning on empathetic posthumanism and interspecies solidarity really resonated with me in thinking about my own talk. So I hope maybe you'll find some resonance too. Okay, so got to hit start. Sara Baume's 2015 debut novel, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, has been commended for what Amy Weiss Meyer described in The Atlantic as a portrait of the human mind, and for its concomitant exploration of the cost of social isolation. The novel follows the loneliness, past abuse, and insecurity of town outcast Ray as he lives and then travels with his rescued dog, One Eye. Despite the largely second-person narrative relayed by Ray, however, his perspective does not stand in isolation. Rather, through his observations, the reader is able, bless you, to witness the independent tempers, desires, and responses of his canine companion throughout the novel, illustrating One Eye's autonomous motivations, moods, and desires. Taking One Eye's agency as a starting point, this analysis considers how Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither goes beyond a narrow focus on human society. Such an emphasis is systematically eroded by the quality time Ray spends with One Eye, by the empathetic connection they share, and by the camaraderie they enjoy. However, the novel also examines spaces of disconnect and alterity that emphasize One Eye's nature as an independent being. While the text does explore the cost of and suffering that human societal exclusion can cause, as well as the ways in which people can project upon their animal companions, then it also offers an alternative. Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither ultimately argues that a more inclusive society that recognizes non-humans as subjects can provide a healthier, more nurturing alternative to the conventional, limited, anthropocentric society, an alternative grounded in mutuality, empathy, and respect. So, spoiler alert, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither follows a year in the life of a 57-year-old Irishman named Ray, who lives alone in his dead father's house. Ray picks up a dog, One Eye, from a local shelter. We learn that his initial motivation was to procure a ratter. Beyond this pragmatic intention, however, Ray clearly identifies with what he perceives as commonalities between him and One Eye, as both navigate various forms of physical and arguably social disability. Over the course of a year, Ray and One Eye develop a relationship of affection and trust. When One Eye, who is not well socialized, to say the least, frightens a local boy and attacks his dog, Ray flees, dog in tow, to avoid having One Eye impounded or worse. As Ray and One Eye slowly succumb to the harsh elements of homelessness, winter, exclusionary societies, dwindling money and food, Ray begins to despair. He ultimately commits suicide, but not before releasing One Eye to freedom and survival at text's end. So a large part of the novel concentrates on Ray's sense of inadequacy, exclusion, and isolation. In part, this reflects Ray's perception of his own physical limitations. He claims that he has, quote, clodhopper feet and mismeasured legs, which gives him a limp. And he repeatedly describes himself as resembling a troll. Ray avoids speaking his own name, a symptom of his self-alienation, and he accepts that he will be received as strange, given that he is, quote, a boulder of a man, shabbily dressed and sketchily bearded. Ray's perception of himself as disabled parallels what could be described as a kind of social handicap as well. Ray sees himself as out of tune with society. He believes that society itself doesn't make sense. As a child, he relays he was too shy, too frightened, and as such, he, quote, didn't believe he was of the same species as other children. Much of the novel centers on these fears and his sense of inadequacy and exclusion. Over the course of the novel, we learn that Ray's sense of isolation, as well as his fear of social intercourse, have largely been caused by the neglect he endured while living with his father, as well as his concomitant lack of experience in social settings. Ray never knew his mother, who seems to have died in childbirth. He was kept home from school. His birthday was only acknowledged by his father once. This lack of socialization leaves him, quote, afraid of almost every single form of social isolation, and especially afraid of children. Ray relates that his father also once abandoned him at the side of the road as a small child, only reclaiming him when a neighbor brought him home. Ray's fears, low self-esteem, and social shortcomings all hail from this neglectful past. These experiences leave Ray lonely and socially inept. More importantly, in addition to fearful, his past makes Ray skeptical of the bonds between humans. Thus, here come the birds. In observing people's differing treatments of a swan and a jackdaw, both were struck and killed. Didn't anybody stop for the jackdaw? Because the swan looks like a wedding dress, that's why. Whereas the jackdaw looks like a bin bag, because this is how people measure life. Ray recognizes the sometimes superficial characteristics that can draw people's approval or rejection. He finds the ways people measure life to be perplexing. As a result, he is cynical about society, averring, quote, community is only a good thing when you're a part of it. Ray's social exclusion is a central premise of the text. Ray's empathetic selection of One Eye is consonant with his sense of isolation and exclusion. In looking at the dogs available for adoption, Ray is drawn to One Eye's, quote, mangled face and what he recognizes as a familiar great lump of fear. Ray identifies with One Eye's flaws, and this is a quote, your legs are all bone, your shoulders all brawn, your neck's too thick for your body, your mouth's too wide for your head. You have a gaudy scar in the place where your left eye used to be. By naming the dog One Eye, Ray turns the dog's physical disabilities into the defining trait of his identity, just as he sees himself solely through the lens of his own perceived flaws. Joseph O'Connor notes that as Ray increasingly identifies with One Eye, quote, the mutilated dog becomes a projection of the narrator's desires, losses, and thwarted longings, a transcendence of self into the realm of radical identification. For example, when one eye hides, uncertain whether his new home is safe, Ray reads this through his own history of fear. Quote, I know you're disconcerted, but you have to learn to fathom your way through a world of which you are frightened, as I have learned. When one eye sighs, Ray projects his own emotional state onto one eye. Quote, sometimes I see the sadness in you, the same sadness that's in me. Finally, Ray also relates to one eye as a fellow social misfit. Because the dog is not socialized, Ray keeps them both away from crowds, either by remaining in their yard or by frequenting an isolated pebbled strand. He notes, I'm all on my own, like you. Ray effectively reads one eye through his own social, emotional, and physical histories and realities. Such projections not only enable Ray to process his past, which is what most critical readings of the novel say, they also allow him to establish an emotional bond with one eye as unwanted outsiders. When Ray fears that one eye will be taken from him, he admits, I never expected I could be so stupidly afraid of losing you. Leaving the only home he has ever known, Ray avers, I must go on because of you. And he acknowledges that one eye is his, quote, reason for doing things. Ray quickly comes to see one eye himself, not only as a companion, but as both safety and home. In fact, Ray soon sees one eye as an inextricable part of himself. Quote, I find it hard to picture a time when we were simultaneously alive yet separate. Now you are like a bonus limb. Now you are like my third leg, an unlimping leg, and I am the eye you lost. Reflecting on the death of his father, he states that there was, quote, just the old man and me, and then just me, and then you, and then us. Stressing his sense that, unlike with him and his father, he and one eye together form a unit. Ray even dreams that he experiences the world from one eye's perspective, for example, seeing it through his blinded eye, or dreaming that he is running, with one eye's maggot nose and fur on his ankles. Such moments reflect Ray's deep emotional investment in one eye, as he imagines them as a singular whole. While Ray has named the dog for his disability, then his to Ray, he and the dog truly represent one subject, one eye. Despite these appropriations and projections, however, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither extends beyond Ray's isolation or his individual perspective. The novel takes pains also to show how one eye stands outside such appropriations as an independent, agential subject, and how Ray comes increasingly to understand and respect this difference. This is accomplished in the novel in several ways, through Ray's avoidance of humanizing one eye, through the manner in which Ray picks up one eye's attributes, through the text's representation of the dog's separate history, moods, and thoughts, and through one eye's own decision-making and agency. Even as Ray projects upon one eye, he does not humanize him, nor does he seek to subordinate him as a lesser being. As Orsolia Jux rightly notes, quote, the connection he has with his dog is one that does not involve inequality, degradation, or dominion. On the contrary, Ray intentionally avoids this. Quote, I was wrong to try to impose something of my humanness on you when being human never did me any good. Ray is deliberate in respecting one eye's fundamental alterity. Quote, I'm going to let you chase and rove and zigzag feverishly to be your own unhuman and unprogrammable self. Rather than devaluing one eye as a dog, Ray respects and even admires his difference. This recognition of dissimilarity does not prevent Ray from respecting their shared communion and commonalities, however, either. As with the jackdaw earlier in the text, when Ray sees a dead shrew, for example, he positions the value of his, one eye's, and the shrew's lives as equally weighted. Quote, its lost life was worth no more or less than yours or mine, than the man in the Pope mobile or the sardines in the sardine tin. Such moments show that Ray accepts one eye as a companion rather than as something subordinate. He sees them both as part of a wider whole, the animal kingdom, rather than only as members of a separate species. Thus, his ability to see one eye and himself as completing each other, as we have seen, does suggest his identification, but it also also bespeaks the respect and equality through which he views their relationship. Ray has learned tolerance from his own societal exclusion rather than to be judgmental. He thus employs a broader, more empathetic definition of society than the human one he cynically critiques. Additionally, Ray is as likely to read his own behavior through one eye as he is to read one eye through his own experiences. His ability to identify with one eye in his dreams can be seen as appropriative, but while it shows Ray's act of radical identification, it also reinforces that their social intercourse is, to Ray's mind, predicated on mutuality. As they continue to journey together, Ray increasingly recognizes their impact on one another. Quote, "On the outside, we are still as black and gnarled as nature made us, but on the inside, I feel different somehow. I feel animalized. Now there's a wildness in me that kicked off with you." Ray's repeated recourse to claiming he has been animalized emphasizes his sense that theirs is a relationship of exchange, not a unidirectional engagement. He respects him as a fellow creature with his own nature and subjectivity. The novel further reinforces One Eye's agency and Ray's respect for his subjective difference through Ray's frequent acknowledgement of his inability to know all of One Eye's thoughts, desires, or history. Ray is often left to speculate about One Eye's thoughts, repeatedly wondering, what are you thinking? He can only speculate about One Eye's experience of the world as he wonders what the dog can see, hear, or smell. As Ray considers some things that trouble him, he realizes he does not know what bothers One Eye. Quote, "With your nose glued to the air vents, your 1,000-mile stare, I wonder, what are the things that trouble you?" Such passages are a reminder that for all Ray's speculation, One Eye remains an independent and at times inscrutable being. Ray also recognizes that he does not have full access to One Eye's history. He can only wonder whether One Eye has ever seen sand before or whether he was abused in the past. Ray's awareness of One Eye's discrete emotional life and history reinforces his understanding of One Eye as a discrete entity rather than merely as a reflection of himself. Finally, Falter whether consistently reminds us that One Eye has his own decision-making ability and agency. Although he is sometimes frustrated by the dog's behavior, Ray recognizes One Eye as an independent self. Quote, "You're yourself again, the self who doesn't sit or halt or stay. Still, I must admire the way you suit yourself." Perhaps more importantly, Ray witnesses the dog exercise his agency not only in defiance of Ray's actions, but in acts of love and devotion. Although One Eye does often run off, Ray recognizes that, quote, "You always come back to me in your own time." When Ray moves away from One Eye, he wonders why he waits for him. Quote, "I wonder why you don't make a break for the hills. Now you must realize you'd make it. Still, you're waiting for me." Perhaps most poignantly, when Ray, angered that the dog has, again, snapped at someone, reenacts his own childhood abandonment and leaves One Eye at the side of the road, One Eye does not run off. Instead, he sits and waits for Ray to return. Quote, "You stay as you are in the road at exactly the point where I dropped you. I watch you in the rear view mirror. I speed back. You're still as I left you, your lonely peepholes fixed on the spot at which my taillights disappeared. Now you're on your feet. Now you're beating your stubby tail with all your strength." One Eye's independence, his subjective decision-making, and his agential loyalty to Ray all cement the fact that this is a relationship, a dialogical bond between two beings, rather than a unidirectional dynamic or a matter of hierarchical possession. Importantly, Ray facilitates that dynamic rather than working against it, reinforcing that their relationship presents an alternative model of society predicated on mutuality, love, and respect. Ray's ultimate acknowledgement of the nature of his and One Eye's social bond is poignantly reflected in the text's ending. Although Ray succumbs to his own despair, seeing no means to escape from the privation of their situation and the consequences of his own actions, he recognizes One Eye's separateness and independence, and that his dog companion should not be subject to his own decisions and choices. Quote, "You don't belong to me, One Eye. I was wrong to ever treat you like you did." Ray's renouncement of his prior assertion that he and One Eye formed a composite whole, One Eye, affirms this awareness. Quote, "I'm sorry, I'm listing the last thing as though you can't see it all, as though I am the eye you lost. Ray's decision to release one eye is the ultimate act not only of love, but also of acknowledgement. In appreciating the relationship they had, he also shows one eye the respect of differentiation and acknowledgement. So to conclude, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither is a heart-wrenching study of the cost of loneliness, neglect, and isolation. However, it also presents us with an alternate model of social exchange, of society as accepting, mutual, and inclusive. By representing Ray's acts of identification and alienation, his attempts at appropriation, as well as his evolving sense of differentiation and respect, the novel proffers a wider, more accepting, and ultimately restorative alternative to more limited human society. Although Ray is finally unable to overcome his own personal history, his time with one eye grants him a period of acceptance, love, and mutuality. He in turn reciprocates with generosity, love, and eventually surrender to and acceptance of one eye's subjectivity. Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither illustrates the opportunity that a broader definition of society, including human and non-human animals and predicated on mutuality and respect, can afford, perhaps even as a remedy to the shortfalls of a human-centered model of society. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We will listen to our second talk before we then take questions after the two presentations. So our second speaker for today, for this panel, is Dilara Yilmaz, who is a doctoral researcher and assistant lecturer at the chair of English literature at Kiel University in London, Germany. After obtaining a Master of Education in German Studies, English and North American Studies, and History, she completed a subsequent Master of Arts in English and American Literatures, Cultures, and Media. Her research interests include contemporary Irish literature, Ireland's creative economy, as well as media representations of neurodivergence, boredom, and disaffect. She's currently working on her PhD dissertation, which is entitled Conditions of Contemporary Irish Women's Fiction Writing, for which she meets authors and other creators in Ireland's literary industry. She teaches Irish and British literary and cultural studies to undergraduates at Kiel University. Her talk today is called Irish Animals in the Anthropocene, Non-Human Voices in Contemporary Irish Literature. And I think we need to also change the screen, right? Do we need to share the screen? Is it already shared? Okay, perfect. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so my contribution today will not be about pets or farm animals or mythological creatures, but about non-human animals. So neither pets nor any other form of domesticated animal. And contemporary literature means I will be looking at texts from 2019 to 2023, so fairly recent. So in Imre Ryan's novel, the characters trudge along the wet-packed sand with the occasional shell or crab carcass crunching underfoot. The ocean washes closer, whispery, as if to shush them. Huge gulls circle over their heads. So this short scene mirrors what other contemporary texts do too. They portray human interaction with nature or human movement towards a natural environment, always in the presence of a very observant wildlife. And while many of these texts have an omniscient narrator, very often the one perceiving what's happening seems to be a non-human animal. And very often we also see these encounters of the human with nature, especially humans with non-human animals, presented in very poetic language. So in this example, also a lot of onomatopoeia, assonance, consonants, and seems to be very misleadingly harmonic, and I will get to that. However, human presence is always displayed as an interference and a disturbance to non-human animals. In fact, human interaction makes wildlife very often appear grotesque in their own habitat, and human behavior alienates the animal from its own home. In Jen Carson's short story, for example, about a stranded dead whale, we read, "People are taking photos. Each flash flusters the seagulls who settle close to the whale corpse. They rise suddenly, hover, and seconds later return to Earth like plastic bags caught in the circling breeze." So here, seagulls appear as plastic bags, or compared to plastic bags, which are the symbol of human interference in nature, or natural environments, I would say. And in a different short story by a different writer, Sheila Armstrong, we again see a very powerful natural environment that is shaped and actually blunted by human behavior. And again here, wildlife is merely the observer, and more so literally frozen. The rocks off the coast of Antrim are a warm brown. Tourists have worn the sharp edges down with their footfall and the shutters of their cameras. These gunmetal columns are severe and wild. They could have sprung up yesterday rather than thousands of years ago. Waves crash into the caves all along the shoreline, and an audience of seabirds is frozen against the wind. In a different short story by Sheila Armstrong, we read, "The girl digs with a flattened spade, channeling a duck pool of water to the sea. She has made a throne for the hollowed out carcass of a crab and decorated it with dried seaweed." Here we see a dead non-human animal that is denied peace and death, I'd say, and instead degraded to a toy. We could also say it's being honored, but we could also argue that it's the opposite. In that same story, we then read about two brown-haired boys. They find a star-scented jellyfish stranded by the tide and pull it to pieces with sticks. The stinging cells are toothless against their water-safe sandals. Here, a starfish is mutilated for fun. The boy's shield is a waterproof synthetic material that again presents a very stark contrast to the natural world that the boys are in. Later in that same story, the two boys are arguing over a heated transaction of shells. Spiraling periwinkles are coppers, empty razor clams are silver, and the single, almost whole sea urchin is gold. So eventually, that non-human animals are entirely objectified because they're treated as currency. And that's definitely very void of agency. In the beginning of that short story about children on the beach, we are introduced to that natural habitat by a description of the ocean, a mighty natural entity, and that entity is being stabbed by human architecture. We read, "Warm morning light is reflected off buildings and red metal sea marks, stabbing at the deep dark of the ocean. Some batters its way down past the foam rollers, weakens and resurfaces. Down under the sand, the razor climbs burrow with a pale muscle, a tongue stretched to its thickest in a mouth full of secrets." So unlike in the previous examples, the text here shows us the power that lies within this particular clam as being shielded from human interference and threats by being in a very remote and secure position, a place where humans usually cannot reach unless they have gigantic drills, which unfortunately they do. And actually in many of these contemporary texts that I've been looking at, we see more of this sort of agency and power that non-human animals hold. And also in this case with the clam, I think the notion of secrets also can be interpreted as secrecy being a symbol of some sense of resilience that the animals keep. It's not moving. So in a third short story, still the same author, Sheila Armstrong, we are presented three mischievous hares that are entirely unfazed by human threats. In the crepuscular light, a hare slinks out from the copse of trees, and over the wall, another follows it. and another. The three hares leap to the center of the road, turning to stare, unconcerned, down the barrel of the headlights. The three animals face the swiftly approaching car, ears back and noses high, not dazzled nor frightened a tick. The man considers driving over them for a moment, just a moment, then brakes hard. All the three turn in unison and bound back across the belly of the wall. The driver slowly switches off his engine, opens the car door, and steps out to follow them into the field. So in that story, we also later read that this field is the location of a fairy fortress, a hole, and the hares lead this human that threatened them to that hole. And we don't know what happens to them, but we know it's a place where humans have disappeared before. Now, we can clearly read this also in allusion to human-animal metamorphosis, the figure of the hare, and it's very mythological as well. But I would like to focus simply on the display of non-human superiority here, because we encounter these hares in control. They're not rattled a bit, and they are also united against this human threat. And they are also able to disable this threat by luring it into a very dark place. And we see a similar non-human command over humans in Francis Mecon's novel that tells us, up to 10 crows used to come into the yard at a time, and Maeve would venture out with an offspring of one kind or another. The crows began to leave things in the yard for her. She left it a few days, and they came onto the windowsill in the kitchen and started hammering on the glass with their beaks. Ma'am got afraid of them, so Maeve had to stop. Here we observe a very eerie superiority of the crows. They demand human service, and they even revert to aggression to obtain that service. Although biologically, they definitely do not need it. They could find their own food. And also the crow also has a mythological dimension as well, obviously. So after these examples from various different texts, let me quickly summarize what we have observed about non-human animals so far. So there is definitely an emphasized presence in human nature encounters. And while non-human animals are mostly the observers with obstructed agency, there is a strong sense of resilience despite this obstruction. Very often these animals comment on human interaction, or they appear to be judging that interaction, or also just human action to nature. And humans are mostly or almost always portrayed as invaders through that non-human lens, which is not surprising, I guess. And there are always clashes of the human with the non-human world. Interestingly, I couldn't find any harmonic encounter between humans and non-human animals. There seems to be no symbiosis possible there. So either the non-human animals are in charge and retain all this agency, like the hares and crows, or the humans do. And if the humans do, they always act destructively. Also, interestingly, there is a very noticeable use of poetic language, and the verbs and adjectives used for the animals are very humanizing very often. There are many texts that fulfill these criteria. I could go on and on with all the examples, but most prominently are the short fiction and the novel by Sheila Armstrong that you can see on the slide. And also there is a literary magazine that's become quite popular in Ireland, which is called Channel. And that's an Irish literary magazine that is dedicated to publish stories that exclusively focus on human interaction with non-human or with nature. And Sheila Armstrong's novel was only published last year, and her short story collection in 2022. And it seems to be the writer who sort of captures all of the observations very strongly and condensed in her texts. So let me show you my last few text examples from Sheila Armstrong's debut novel, Falling Animals. And the novel is a multi-narrative, so it's a composite novel made of 18 different chapters, and each chapter has a different protagonist. And all have an omniscient narrator, and very often there are animals present, so we could always also see the focalization being through the eyes of these animals. So we'll have a look at the beginning of the novel, of the first story, and the first story is about a collector of dead animals. He tries to park as close to the carcass as he can. Through the windscreen, the seal looks so pristine it might have just pulled itself out of the ocean to rest, propped up in an alert position, empty eye sockets staring blankly out to sea. Closer up, there will be flies, he knows from experience, squirming things to pull the seeds of life from death. The country council usually ignore these strandings, if they hear about them at all. They are happy to wait for the animal to quietly decompose or leave on the next tide. But this seal, a casualty of the storm, has wedged itself firmly between two small mounds of rock above the shoreline and seems determined to cling on. The village overlooking the beach is teeming with tourists, with delicate stomachs and a tendency to complain. So Frank has been sent to remove what the sea will not wash away. A pair of red-beaked gulls lift their heads and scream at him as he approaches, clattering their way into the air, disappearing behind swathes of marine grass further up the beach. So again, we have a very agitated non-human audience, and clearly a human intruder. Goes on. Many years hauling fallen livestock has taught him that cattle and horses are prone to leakage. Sheep with heavy winter wool are the worst, like a kitchen sponge that looks bone dry but spills out foulness once lifted. Frank considers just loosening the seal enough for it to roll back down the beach to feed the crabs and little lives of the ocean. But the council expects an invoice from the incinerator, so a seal he must produce. So here again, human action prohibits other animals to naturally benefit from another animal's death. And I find the word choice also very interesting, to produce a naturally dead animal. Sandhoppers emerge as he disturbs the scene, their small fingernail bodies unfolding and leaping Olympic heights into the air. Crabs too, greedy little things, still grabbing clawfuls of flesh as his spade comes down a hair's breadth from them. He splits one cleanly in two. Its brain doesn't immediately realize it is dead, and both claws still extend and return to their half of the alien mouth. So the collector is not just clearly an intruder, he also mutilates a non-human animal and literally alienates it from itself. And lastly, while he worked, the high tide has slipped away to reveal a distant sandbank. Out there, chunks of the shipwreck are beginning to emerge, revealing the remains of iron ribs and a fragmented hull. Black glossy seals loll up out of the water onto the sand beside it, turning to stare at him curiously. He raises two fingers to the animals, an acknowledgement to their loss, an apology for disturbing their fallen comrade. So here we have, after the stabbing of the crab, we have a sudden turn of a very respectful interaction and mutual interest from the seals, but also the collector. And then the shipwreck in the ocean that's suddenly revealed by the tide also again enforces this nature-culture dichotomy. I have also spoken to Sheila Armstrong for another part of research last year, and she said, what I am good at is creating a kind of vibe, an emotion, a landscape, writing about landscape as character. Landscape as background, but also as important as the characters themselves. And with landscape, she also means the animals. She further said, it's how I feel as a person existing in the world. You know, I go out somewhere and I feel like what's around me, and the natural world is as important as I am. And a lot of the times you even feel like an intruder, especially when you go somewhere wild. I also like to invoke a lot of the, let's say, violence of the natural world as a kind of parallel to how we humans treat it. So the novel's title, Falling Animals, is a wordplay. And Sheila explained there's a lot of like governmental documents on how to deal with fallen animals. And I was going through those and I came across this phrase, It's such a lovely phrase for something so horrible. It's so euphemistic. So fallen animals describe dead livestock and wildlife, and there are a gazillion regulations on how to depose them. But the term obviously is a euphemism because these animals, while they are like wild, they don't fall naturally, but they vary. The natural deaths, they occur very often due to human interaction, or they are a result of a very long chain of cause and effect that's human-made. And the present tense then of the title points out that these animals are still continuously, actively falling, and increasingly so due to human behavior. So to wrap this up, going back to my initial statement, Irish animals in the Anthropocene, non-human voices in contemporary Irish literature. We've seen that non-human animals are a constant and very admonishing presence. They appear as a voice and characters, never as protagonists, except for one badger in one story by Sheila Armstrong. But they are more than just the setting and more than the background. And with voice, I want to also point out what I said earlier about this omniscient narrator, but then focalizes through the animals. Nature and non-human animals comment on the human condition by doing so. And the human characters, by their interference and their clumsiness in the natural space, they seem grotesque and they are ridiculed and displaced. And it just emphasizes their inadequacy in natural surroundings. Thus, I agree with what Laura Brown has said. She says, I argue that imaginary animals provide a new lens through which to examine the significance of the non-human being for human identity, human experience, and human history. Within literary texts and forms, these animals offer opportunities for disruption, innovation, and even transcendence. They create new genres, produce strange affiliations, and disturb given norms and hierarchies. So lastly, contemporary Irish literature yields a very distinct eco-criticism. These texts discuss the ever-growing impact of human activities on Earth and nature, as well as non-human animals, which serve as examples. Of this so-called Irish wilderness that is not a wilderness are always countered by human interference, such as behavior, traffic, but also architecture. And there seems to be an Anthropocenic Irish landscape. So that means that Irish nature as such doesn't exist, obviously, but it is profoundly and also irreversibly shaped by human interaction. And I also call these texts Anthropocenic narratives. And by that, I mean that these texts are Anthropocenic in regard to the lack of real agency of these non-human animals, because the humans always remain protagonists, and the humans are always depending on the actions of these human characters. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your talks. We have 15 minutes left for questions. So if you have questions for either of the two or for both of them, please raise your hand and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the presentations. I do have a very brief question to Dilara. You just at the very end in your conclusions that you call those narratives, the short stories and the novels, Anthropocene narratives. Why not anthropocentric narratives? Because you said you're doing this because the humans still take center stage. So how would you approach those two terms?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I guess you could claim it's also it's anthropocentric. My intention was to emphasize that the animals are meant to be also read actively as active characters in that space within the novel, within that fictional world. And yeah, I think that's already it.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
If that makes sense at all.
Can I thank you both for also talking about two incredible writers, well, we talked about many writers that are, but I suppose I really wanted to focus on both Sara Baume and Sheila Armstrong. I suppose it's a comment really inspired by thinking about your papers in the light of what we heard this morning. In Sheila Armstrong's collection, How to Gut a Fish, which is one of the most remarkable short story collections published in the last 2 years in Ireland, there is an absolutely shocking story, I think it's called Red Market, is that right? In which a woman's body is auctioned. So as a piece of meat. And that sort of sense of the abject at centre stage is something I've been trying to think about since we introduced carcasses this morning into the discussion. And this idea of the abject within the discourse of ecosystem. And it occurs to me that if you like Sarah Bone's portrayal of the abject body is a lot warmer and more empathic, but that what, if you like, positions Armstrong as a writer of cold pastoral in How to Gut a Fish is its proximity to technology. In that, there's a really interesting position of the animal and the bodily and the material in relation to technological culture in Ireland in that collection. And it seemed to me that Sarah Bone's positioning in terms of disability, empathy, interspecies connection is warmer. So I just wanted, I suppose, to just bring those things together because, because you're firing my brain, basically. Sorry, thank you.
I would just like to very briefly say that, you know, a line made by walking, the next book that she wrote, Sarah Baume, is photographing dead animals, roadkill. So there's like, there is a connection.
Yeah, there is that
Yeah.
kind of continuity in those books. Yeah, did you want to take that, say something about that? No? Well, I mean, in terms of the warmth of it, I mean, I think one of the things that I wasn't able to really capture, except maybe with the tail wagging, is how completely delightful the representation of One Eye is. I mean, especially if you're someone who has an ornery dog like I do. It's so completely relatable, and she does a remarkable job of giving you a sense of the agency of the dog. And I think something that really struck me when I was rereading the novel for this time, that again, I didn't have time to talk about here, is the frame device that she uses in the novel, because it starts with One Eye running right after the badger has injured him and has lost his eye, and his eye is like flapping. It's quite grotesque. But you see the dog in its own context, right? You meet the dog as just the dog. And the ending of that prologue is, he is One Eye now, because he's just lost the eye, which reasserts that idea of his physical disability, which is what Ray seizes on. But when you see him at the end, it's a return. And like all frame devices, of course, what happens in the middle changes your understanding, right? So now we see him and he's back in the same context of his own agential life, his own continuous history. But the ending of the epilogue is just, he is One Eye. So because we now know that he had this interactive engagement with Ray and experienced that kind of naming, he simultaneously owns that intersubjective connection and his own historical individuality. So it's a remarkable text, I think, in those terms. So I don't know if that speaks to what you're saying, but I think that's a part of the warmth, is that she does a great job capturing and releasing One Eye, you know, so.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, thank you for two really fascinating papers. I have, well, a question for both of you, or well, two questions actually. Maybe I can start with my question for Dilara. Because, well, you talked about
Anthropocene or anthropocentric narratives, where the focus is very much on the human, right? So we heard about poetry this morning, which really foregrounds entanglement, which is something that Haraway argues for because she's so critical of the term Anthropocene. I was wondering, does the fiction that you presented, does it preserve anthropocentrism? Does it use the animal as kind of an instrument and thus also maintain the nature culture divide? Or what does it do when you think about, because you talked about the voices, you know, is that the voice of the landscape or, yeah, so what's the effect of that?
So the voice of the landscape is something that Sheila Armstrong said in the interview that I did with her. That's just her intention to actually not stick to the idea of the Anthropocene. But then the question is, do her texts do that? And I think looking at the texts and also the other texts that I looked at, the non-human animals and the humans, they don't really entangle positively and without harm. And they rarely ever do. If there is sort of this mutual respectful situation, it's the one that I described from afar with a distance, where the seals cannot harm the human and the human cannot harm the seals. But we do not have like a physical or emotional entanglement of any sort. That's why I opted for the choice of the Anthropocene, because while ideally and theoretically, I think I agree with the criticism on the term, you can't really see that in the literature. The literature that I looked at is a bit more pessimistic, maybe even, yeah.
Well, I think there are some stories that really entangle the non-human animal and the human animal. Maybe I can say something about that later if you're interested.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. So I was very interested in that. And then maybe a quick question for Kathleen. So thank you very much for this reading. I can not read novel so far, I have to say. You talked about a redefinition of society. Well, I myself am working on community and discourses, counter discourses. And I was wondering, would you also see this, well, interaction between human and dog also as kind of community, or is that rather narrative anti-community?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking of community just in the sense of communion, in the sense of exchange. And there is exchange that's not, I think the risk of the text, because it's second person narrative, is to assume that you're always only getting Ray's perspective. But it feels to me like not only in his acknowledgement of the fact that the dog, you know, is inaccessible in certain respects, right? Impregnable almost, right? But also the fact that there is that dedication and interaction socially. So I think that passage where One Eye, I mean, it almost makes me cry. It's so beautiful and powerful when One Eye sits there and he abandons him, which replicates his own abandonment as a child, right? But which has that generational quality, right, of human life, and bespeaks family, which I didn't get to talk about, but that's a thing in the novel too. He does say to him, twice, you are my whole family, you are all of my family, right? And that's a kind of the most fundamental cell of community and society, right? So there is that, but also the fact that the dog can make the choice to sit and wait. So I do very much see it as they are a mini community, but it becomes more than just the community of human isolation that he chooses and from which he feels ostracized. He's not necessarily entirely reliable. So he says things like, I know those people think, you know, see me walk by a playground and they write down my license plate. They don't think I see them, but I do. And it's like, well, last I checked, Ray, you can't read their minds. So they may not actually be doing that. And when he has a nice exchange with a woman, after the exchange, he's like, maybe she was pretending and poisoned my food. So he's not the most reliable person. So I don't feel like, even though it's second person, you're locked solely into his perspective. And so I think the familial element, the interchange between the two, expands what seems initially to be a human restriction of the notion of community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think I saw quite a few hands coming up here. Not too many though, that's good. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the presentations. It's very interesting. And from a very personal position, as someone who adopted a dog from the streets from Romania, I have learned that more than with my dog before, who came to us as a puppy, you also learn with the animal because it doesn't fit into your sphere as well as a puppy does. And I wanted to ask you if you maybe want to elaborate a little bit on like the becoming with or learning with the animal, that the co-species evolution with pets, so having we done Harbour already, that you can find in this novel, because I felt like from what you talked about, he's learning quite a lot about himself and about the dog and about the world while he's journeying.
Yeah, I mean, I think a part of that is what I just referenced, the fact that he is shown that he can be loved. And I think that's a big, big part of the text. But in terms of learning, there's a line in about the first 20 pages. I think it's like the first 12 pages or so of the novel, where he says, I have accidentally trained you, but you've trained me too. And so, you do learn, like, I am not a morning person, it's ugly, but my dog is. So I learned, and now I wake up automatically at like 8 o'clock because that's what she requires. And so I was retrained in that way in order to accommodate the dog. So I think the text in many ways, showing his habits, although he does feed the dog chocolate all the time, which is a terrible idea. But, he learns to kind of understand the dog's rhythms and to anticipate its behaviors. And I do think that goes to the question of mutuality, right? And also back to your wonderful question about community, right? Because there is an interactive, interspecies kind of engagement here, which is not unidirectional. Does that make sense? Sure.
I think we do have time for one last brief question here.
Hey, just the question I had, I don't know the novel, okay, but you described it so beautifully, I feel like I was there. And this is the question that came up for me before you talked about the framing, so I think maybe you've already answered it. But I was wondering if you had anything else to say about the ending. And I think I'm kind of a casualty of in my early career of many, the fallen woman who gets killed off. So there was a part of me that wanted the healing that goes on with the dog that you described so beautifully to be successful, I guess. So the frame makes it all the sense in the world about the strategy of the novel, but I guess I'm just wondering how you felt about that.
So I'll put my trauma hat on for a second. One reason I think the novel, and this is maybe just it's too inflected by other texts, but I do think that one reason Ray ends up as he does is because he does have a history of trauma, and that doesn't just magically disappear, right? As we all know. So I think there's a degree to which he kind of backs himself into a corner. And once he's got an allowance that he was spending, when the money runs out, he has no concept of how to get more money. He never even mentions the word get a job. Like, he doesn't have the training socially, and he's too terrified of basically everything. So I think he really just doesn't see a way out. However, to give you a little bit of hope, he does, sorry again to those of you who haven't read it, he actually let his father choke on a piece of sausage and buried him in the attic, which is why he needed a ratter. Okay. Sorry. But he drags his father's bones out of the attic and floats them out to sea. It's a really very funny, kind of crazy ending of the novel, but that does give him a kind of peace. And as he is basically about to drown, his thinking is about the happy memories he has with the dog.
He imagines an alternative ending.
Yes,
For them.
that's right.
Happen, but he does imagine.
Yeah.
They could have done it this way.
That's right. And he also does throughout the novel build memories with the dog, which I didn't have time to talk about. He says things like, do you remember when we did this? Do you remember when we did that? And so there's a history that they develop in common, which is why I think, to your point about the frame device, it's a both and, because they now have that history that the intersubjectivity of his naming affected, but the dog also has an independent history, which is recursive because of the frame device, and they don't cancel each other out. They run in tandem. Yep.
Okay, if there are no remaining questions for the time being, I suggest that we take questions if there are any into the break. But before we go into the break, let us give another round of applause. First, our second part of Imagined Animal. I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker of the second part, who is Franca Leitner. Franca is a PhD candidate in Irish Studies at the University of Mannheim. She graduated from the University of Freiburg with an MA in British and North American Cultural Studies in 2022. And her PhD dissertation focuses on the representations of precarity and homelessness in contemporary Irish fiction of the post-Celtic tiger period. Today, Franca is talking about haunting humans, animals in Tana, Frenches in the woods, and Broken Harbour. So the stage is yours.
Thank you for this nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be back in Würzburg. And I would like to start this talk with an anecdote that is told by the artist Blind Boy Boat Club in an episode of his podcast from 2022 titled "What Made Things So Difficult for Irish Millennials." Now it's no longer working. Oh, okay. Blind Boy here describes an incident that took place in an exclusive nightclub in Dublin in 2010. A marsupial, more specifically a wallaby, was brought into the nightclub, allegedly given drugs and sexually assaulted, which resulted in its death. And Blind Boy states, the night the wallaby died because someone gave it ecstasy was the night the Celtic tiger died. This was a symbolic moment because it echoed and represented everything that was excessive and disgusting and irresponsible about Celtic tiger excesses. So Blind Boy here explicitly links the Irish economic boom, which ended with the financial crisis in 2008 and then exacerbated in the following years with Ireland having to apply for financial aid from the International Monetary Fund and the European Union in 2010. And he links it explicitly with an act of animal cruelty. And the dead wallaby seems to be just one example of the widespread animal abuse that occurred during the boom and in its immediate aftermath. So in an article in the Irish Examiner from 2011, Aoife Dowling explained that reckless breeding on the one hand and the effects of the recession on people's financial situation on the other had led to surging numbers of abandoned pets, in particular horses or pedigree dogs, but also more exotic animals such as turtles, which were bought as status symbols during the boom years. And Dowling describes how the once prized animals are being abandoned in some horrific ways, with shelters and animal rescue organizations barely able to handle the situation and to provide shelter to the now unwanted pets. And the situation of wild, so non-domesticated animals in Ireland was hardly better. So in the context of the Celtic tiger years, Maureen O'Connor actually speaks of an ecological disaster in Ireland. And in the same vein, Tim Wenzel observes in his critical study, Emerald Green, that the advent of progress, and he's speaking here about the boom years, has manifested itself in a landscape that is quickly diminishing Ireland's natural world, thereby destroying natural habitats for animals. And the development O'Connor and Wenzel point to was further enabled and aggravated by the fact that Ireland has some of the most flexible environmental protection laws in Europe. So it is this development that I've just described that is reflected in Tana French's crime novels In the Woods, published in 2007, and Broken Harbour, published in 2012, the first and fourth book in her Dublin Murder Squad series. French novels, which can be classified as belonging to the Emerald Noir genre, are renowned for their acute portrayals of contemporary Ireland, and they have even been described as state-of-the-nation novels. That these portrayals include a critical commentary on Ireland's ecological degradation and the increasing loss of natural spaces is not necessarily surprising. In her analysis of Benjamin Black's Emerald Noir series Quirk, Auxiliadores Peres points out that writers of the noir genre contribute in significant ways to the cultural perceptions of issues relating to the environment and its common crisis. However, and despite the fact that French ISWÜ has received enormous economic success as well as academic interest, the role of animals has so far garnered little academic attention. The aim of this paper is to outline how the haunting presence or absence of animals in the woods and Broken Harbour draws attention to and formulates a stark critique of both animal cruelty and the ongoing destruction of natural spaces, as well as articulating an underlying fear of the consequences of the irreversible loss, of a unique flora and fauna in Ireland. And in reading these animals in French novels as haunting entities, I will draw on Avery Gordon's work on hauntology in her monograph Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, in which she points out that ghosts can be read as social figures, drawing attention to unresolved acts of social violence. And while Gordon focuses on acts of violence committed by human against other humans, I will here try to apply this theory to acts of violence committed against non-humans, so against animals. I will also refer to Emily Alder's eco-Gothic reading of a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Captain of the Pole Star, in which a whale hunting ship is haunted by spectral appearances. Alder notes that despite the purpose of the Pole Star's voyage, whales are notably missing from the narrative, audible and visible only through the traces of an elusive phantom, a phantom through which the story codes a nascent awareness of an ecological tragedy. And this same awareness is created through the elusive phantom-like animal in Tana French's debut novel In the Woods, in which the question is raised whether the disappearance of 2 children in the 1980s in a densely wooded area near the village of Knocknarea could have been caused by a large and monstrous animal. The narrator of the novel, Adam Robert Ryan, he was with his friends in the woods when they disappeared. He was found some hours later. He was scarred, his t-shirt was ripped, and he was suffering from amnesia. Ryan then later became a detective in the Dublin murder squad. This is when we meet him in the novel, kind of. And he still cannot remember what happened, and no one except his detective partner is aware of his past. And no trace of his 2 friends was ever found. And he is then kind of forced to return to the Knocknarea woods to investigate another crime. So he's kind of confronted once again with this place of his childhood trauma. And in the course of the investigation, the idea of a large and dangerous animal roaming the woods is first raised during the interrogation of a woman called Sandra. She was a teenager at the time when the children disappeared, and she remembers something from the days from the time a few days before the children's disappearance. So Ryan's detective partner interviews her, and she reports back, and I quote from the novel here: "They heard something in the trees just a few yards away. Sandra said she never heard anything like it. Like an enormous bird flapping its wings, she said, only she's positive it was a voice, a call. It sounded big, she said, at least the size of a person. And there was a smell, a strong animal smell, like goats or something, or what you get at the zoo." Ryan then considers this theory to be very unlikely. So he states that Ireland's most ferocious form of wildlife is probably badgers, but he admits thinking, and I quote again, "unwillingly of the ribs across the back of my t-shirt." So there is kind of this possibility that it might have been an animal. Which goes against the epistemic certainty of the crime fiction genre, where we always assume that's a human who attacks another human. And as the disappearance of the children remains unsolved, it's not, we don't know what happened to them even at the end of the novel. This means that a certain amount of ambiguity and kind of a lingering doubt persists for the reader of this novel. While the animal remains entirely elusive, it, as Timothy Baker claims is so often the case for animals in contemporary fiction, it haunts the peripheries of the novel. So it comes up again and again. It's not in the center of the novel, but it's haunting somewhere around the periphery. Actually, the adaptation of the novel, it's a series called Dublin Murders. It picks up this idea and it takes it a step further by depicting Ryan as actually haunted by a wolf. That's the wolf from the series, who appears, it's an imaginary wolf, and he appears whenever he's alone and confronted with a memory of his traumatic past. But we don't get that as clear in the novel. We never see the animal in the novel. What we get in the novel is kind of an encounter. So Ryan returns to the woods in order to regain his memory. And at one moment, at one point, he feels paralyzed with fear. He says that he was hearing something across the clearing, breathing, something big. And he realized that, like every detective, I had taken it for granted that I was the hunter. It had never occurred to me once that I might have been the hunted all along. Yet as Ryan never comes face to face with the non-human being that seems to threaten him there in the woods, the animal remains a specter rather than an actual threat. Its haunting presence, like the spectral presence of the whales in The Captain of the Pole Star, points, however, to an ecological tragedy, and that is the destruction of the Knocknarea Woods. The felling of the Knocknarea Woods, which happens in the novel, and they are felled to make room for a new motorway, looms large in the novel. And the woods have even been described by Rachel Shaffer as a character in their own right in the woods. Ryan perceives them throughout the novel as a threatening space. He calls them his invincible and stalking against which he has to position himself. And it's not until the last scene of the novel that he realizes, and I quote, "For much of my life, it had been our easy playground and our best loved refuge. It hadn't occurred to me until I saw them cutting it down that it had been beautiful." So Ryan's disregard of and even antipathy towards these wild spaces epitomizes an attitude prevalent in Ireland during the years of the boom. And his realization, so Ryan's realization of the enormous value of the woods and the irrevocable loss that has occurred can be here described as too little, too late. And ultimately, the phantom of the animal is not threatening. As in The Captain of the Pole Star, rather it speaks of an unacknowledged damage caused to animals and the environment, pointing to the ecological catastrophe of deforestation that is described. And as so often in Irish literature, and as Maureen O'Connor again argues in her monograph, The Female and the Species, the animal is here used as a vehicle for the expression of pain and confusion, but not in contrast to an Irish literary tradition, which often aligned the Irish as oppressed people with the animals as another oppressed group. We here have a disconnect. So the animal is clearly representing the pain and confusion of the natural world, of the non-human, and no longer of the human, the Irish people. The destruction of the natural habitat. Okay, and another space which emblemizes this destruction of a natural habitat is the Bryanstown estate in French's fourth novel, Broken Harbour. And once again, we have here a detective who has to go back to a place that is connected with personal trauma. So Mike Kennedy and his detective partner in this novel investigate a triple murder that took place in a newly built estate close to the Irish coast, and the estate is called Bryanstown. It was built during the boom period, and it replaced a small fishing village that was there before, and this fishing village was called Broken Harbour. That's why the novel is called like that. And Detective Kennedy has spent many holidays there as a kid, but he has not returned after his mother's suicide when he was 15. While he states that he used to know Broken Harbour like the back of his hand, he no longer recognizes the place upon his return. Not only is the original name of the place abolished, but the once rural area is fundamentally altered. So he describes, right where the water should have risen into view over a low green hill, though, the estate came charging up out of nowhere and blocked our way like a barricade. The estate is insofar emblematic in that it represents how the natural world in Ireland is pushed back, it's driven to the margins as this kind of barricade of the newly constructed estate is blocking it from view. The idyllic rural area of Broken Harbour, a place where Kennedy remembers seeing the ponies and the field behind us and white lines of sea foam and leggy bird dashing along the sand, has been turned into a residential area which is thoroughly disconnected from the natural world. And once again, this place is haunted by an elusive animal, an animal whose ghostly traces are the result of the development's deliberate building over and rewriting of the land, as Shelley Ingram and Willow Mullins note. Kennedy is called to investigate 3 brutal murders that have taken place at the home of the Spain family. So the father, Patrick Spain, has been murdered, his 2 children have been suffocated, and the mother is taken to the hospital with severe stab wounds. And when reading through Pat's browser histories in the course of the investigations, the detectives become aware that after the loss of his job in the financial crisis, Pat Spain had become more and more obsessed with an animal that he believed to be living in his attic. They reconstruct the history of his obsession through his posts in an online wildlife forum where he kind of, post updates on what has happened again with the animal. He's actually asking for help. As in the woods, the animal remains elusive. So it's only noticeable through sound and smell. So he hears noises throughout the day and there's a musky smell in the attic, but he's never able to see the animal, which he cannot accept. So he's setting up video monitors throughout his house. Yet, as he admits in the forum, it is to no avail. So Pat writes, just to update, I'm trying the video monitor, but so far no good. I know the animal is not gone because I'm hearing it like every day and night. It's getting louder. I think it's more confident, or else maybe it's grown bigger. And when examining the house of the Spains, a wildlife expert actually finds some clues that might indicate that an animal has been there. There's a hole in the attic, it's top-edged, nagged and crumbling, the insulation is nibbled, and there's a roof beam crisscrossed with a frenzy of deep score marks in parallel sets of 3 or 4 that looked like it had been attacked by a jaguar. So there are some indications that this animal could perhaps exist. And we have an impression that is evoked here of a dangerous predator. And this is interesting also if we read this in the context of a phenomenon that's called the alien big cat phenomenon in Ireland. So in his monograph, Rough Beasts, the Monstrous in Irish Fiction, Jack Fennell explains that during the 2000s, many people in Ireland reported seeing big cats such as panthers or pumas in Ireland. Perhaps you remember last year in Berlin when there was this lion that actually turned out to be a wild boar. It's a similar phenomenon. But Fennell also explains that these alien big cats are cryptids, so animals whose existence is suspected, but it cannot be proven. And the same goes here for the animal in Pat Spain's attic. Yeah, there is never any proof that it exists, and it's highly likely that it's imaginary. So the novel suggests that the animal in Broken Harbour is a phantom and that the real danger lies in Pat's obsession with it, which results from his frustration with being unable to provide for his family after the loss of his job. So he explains to his wife, and I quote, "I know you don't deserve to live like this. You deserve all the fancy clothes and expensive curtains in the world. And it's been killing me that I can't give you that stuff. But this at last, this one thing, this I can do. I can get this little fucker. We'll have it stuffed and mounted on the sitting room wall." Christina Jackson points out here that Pat thinks of the animal as an object, an other to keep at bay. And I think we see that pretty clearly here. And like Robert Ryan, which we had in the other novel, Pat positions himself firmly against the natural world, regarding it as an enemy. And he kind of epitomizes again this utter disconnect between the human and the non-human realm. In another parallel to In the Woods, Pat also realizes far too late where the actual danger lies. So his wife, Jenny, has, as it turns out in the end of the novel, she has suffered a nervous breakdown due to his obsession with the animal that she immediately realized was non-existent. And she has actually killed her own children and then Pat in a state of temporary insanity before trying to commit suicide herself. And she survives, and she explains to Kennedy that she did it because he was letting this thing, this animal, this stupid, insane, imaginary, it was never even their animal, he was letting it eat Emma and Jack alive. These are their children. And the novel reveals that the real threat, of course, did not lie with the spectral animal that Pat believed lived in his attic, but more with the metaphorical animal of the Celtic tiger and the human-made economic system, which had ultimately caused Spain's desolate situation. And the real monster, as Kennedy remarks at some point, hides in the dark space at the back of the closet, and it's not an animal, but a box containing the Spain's financial documents. They were never actually threatened by a real animal, but we could say perhaps by the metaphorical animal of the Celtic tiger. And ultimately, I would also like to question this metaphor of the Celtic tiger. I mean, is an animal metaphor apt here? Because I don't think so. It's a human-made economic system, and it's kind of unfair to blame an animal. Emily Johansson observes that in Broken Harbour, the threat lies in the values and norms of neoliberalism and its consequences, the disregard for the natural world, the environment, and the non-human. To conclude, the spectral animals in both novels, they remain in the background, they remain out of sight, but they act as haunting reminders of the ecological catastrophe which unfolded during the boom years and in their aftermath. As Avery Gordon points out, what's distinctive about haunting is that it is an animated state in which a repressed or unresolved social violence is making itself known, sometimes very directly, sometimes more obliquely. The spectral appearances in Tana French's Emerald Noir novels suggest that the haunting animals will continue to make themselves known and will not rest easily as long as the ecological catastrophe and the destruction of natural habitats continues. Thank you.